In the previous video, we looked at the introduction to the different types of blood vessels, where there were 5 types of blood vessels that we talked about: the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and vein. In this particular video, we are going to be just focusing on the artery and arterioles. The artery, if you remember, are just blood vessels that transport blood away from the heart at high pressure, and the arterioles are just smaller branches of the arteries. So, in my diagram here, as you can see, I'm drawing out a heart and their associated blood vessels. I'm not drawing all the blood vessels that are connected to the heart, just like, as close to as reality as possible. And as you can see, there is a very large blood vessel over there that is extending out, and that is known as an artery, which I've colored in pink. So, as a reminder, the artery transports blood away from the heart at high pressure, and the arrow represents the direction of the blood flow. A very important thing to understand is, as the artery moves away from the heart, the further it goes away from the heart, the size of the artery becomes smaller. The artery closest to the heart is quite large. As it moves further away, it becomes smaller, and furthest away from the heart, as you can see, I've labeled there, it is the smallest. That's just the nature of how arteries work in general. Now, arteries are then subdivided into different types. The artery closest to the heart is referred to as something known as an elastic artery. Slightly further away from the heart, we will call the artery something known as a muscular artery. And when they are much further away from the heart and their size is extremely small, that's when we refer to them as something known as arterioles. We have divided the arteries into 3 groups. Now, even though I've divided them into 3 groups, it is important to know that they are all still arteries with very similar structures. So let's look at their basic structure in detail. So at the bottom over here, I'm just drawing a 3-dimensional version of an artery. The shaded region is the artery wall, and the hole in the middle refers to the lumen. The lumen is the hole where the blood is flowing through, like a tube. Now, if we were to draw the artery as a side view, that is when we call it the longitudinal or longitudinal view, and I've also labeled the artery wall and the lumen, so you can see it right there in a 2-dimensional view. A more important section of the artery that as a student you must be familiar with is the transverse or cross section. That is when we are looking at the artery through the highlighted region. The transverse or cross section is the easiest way to look at the artery because we can actually appreciate how thick the artery wall is and how small the lumen is in relation to the artery wall. So this is the more common diagram that as a student you should be familiar with, the transverse or cross section. However, sometimes they may give you the longitudinal view in the exam too, okay? And I've also labeled the lumen and the artery wall. A very important thing to know about the artery wall is the artery wall is divided into the inner wall, which is nearest to the lumen, and the outer wall, which is furthest away from the lumen. And in between the inner wall and outer wall is the middle section or the middle wall, which I've not labeled in this diagram. But not to worry, I'm going to do that later. Now, why do we have to separate the artery wall into the inner, middle, and outer section? The reason is because the inner, middle, and outer section are all made up of different composition. Let's look at the basic structure of the artery. This applies to elastic artery, muscular arteries, and arterioles, so you don't have to worry about that. So in the cross section, remember, it has a very narrow lumen, and the inner wall is made up of a layer which is known as a 1-cell thick endothelium. The 1-cell thick endothelium's function is to minimize friction and blood flow as the blood is moving through the artery at high pressure. This is quite important, by the way, because when the blood is flowing inside the artery at very high speeds, the inner wall has to be smooth so no damage happens to the blood cells within the blood vessels. And slightly just below the one cell thick endothelium, it has elastic fibers, but that's not so important to know in detail. But what we have to understand is the inner layer is made up of two things, the one cell thick endothelium and also a thin layer of elastic fibers. Now, the more important section is actually the middle section, which I've highlighted in pink. It's an extremely thick section. The reason why it's the thickest layer is because it has a lot of structures within it. Now, the middle layer is made up of these purplish things that I've drawn in like squiggly or loopy lines, and those cells are known as smooth muscles. And I'm also drawing some orange color lines. I hope you can see that. Those orange color lines are the elastic fibers, and a very thin layer of green color lines in the middle layer, which are the collagen fibers. I hope you can see them very clearly. So the middle layer, which is the thickest layer of the artery, contains three things: smooth muscles, elastic fibers, and collagen fibers. The outer layer, which I've highlighted in gray, quite thin, all right? It contains two things, which are elastic fibers, or which I've put orange color lines, and also collagen fibers, which I've represented in green color. So as students, you have to memorize what the inner layer contains, what the middle layer contains, and what the outer layer contains. Exam questions can be as straightforward as list out two things that can be found in the outer layer of the artery. Then you have to say, oh, it contains the elastic fibers and collagen fibers. If they ask you, what does the middle layer contain? Then you have to say it contains smooth muscles, elastic fiber, and collagen fibers. The inner layer, just to repeat it again, contains the one cell thick endothelium. And I'm just going to draw out the longitudinal section again. Just looks like a wafer sandwich, right? It has the narrow lumen, the inner layer, which is made up of that green color labels called the one cell thick endothelium. The pink color layer, which I'm highlighting, is the middle layer, which contains the smooth muscle, elastic fibers, and collagen fibers. And of course, last but not least, the outer layer, where it has the elastic fibers and collagen fibers. So the transverse section and the longitudinal section gives you an appreciation as to the difference of layers within the artery. It bears repeating that the lumen of the artery is relatively narrow. The reason why it has to be narrow is because it wants to maintain a quite high blood pressure so that the blood can move quickly within the artery. But because the blood is moving very quickly in the artery, the friction is extremely high. So to minimize the friction, that is why it has the one cell thick endothelium. If the elastic artery, muscular arteries, and arterioles all have the same type of inner layer, middle layer, and outer layer, then how do they differ? What makes them different? Why do they all have slightly different names? This is what we want to see in the next part. So we are going to create a table. And as you can see, when we look at the cross section of the elastic artery, muscular artery, and arterioles, as predicted, their sizes are quite different. As I've told you earlier, the further away the artery moves from the heart, the size becomes smaller. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something called a relative comparison. What I mean by that is I'm going to magnify the size of the muscular arteries, and I'm also going to magnify the size of the arterioles so that it's similar to the size of the elastic artery. By doing so, we can actually have a fair comparison of the elastic artery, muscular artery, and arterioles. That's the main reason. But remember, in reality, elastic artery is the largest, muscular artery is slightly smaller, and arterioles are the smallest. So let's talk similarities first. The similarity is as follows. All three of them have the same type of inner wall where they have the one cell thick endothelium. They also have the same type of outer wall which contains collagen and elastic fiber. Now, what makes them actually different is the middle layer. First thing that you must notice is the middle layer of all three types of arteries are the same in terms of their thickness. They have the thickest layers, so that's fine. but the composition of the middle layer becomes different. As you can see, I'm going to draw out the middle layer of the elastic artery and the muscular artery. Do you notice any difference between them? Immediately you notice that in the elastic artery, the purple coloring is not as much as the one in the muscular artery, but the elastic artery has a lot of those thick orange color lines as compared to the muscular artery. The reason is because for the muscular artery, it has a higher proportion of smooth muscles, but the elastic artery has a lower proportion of smooth muscles. And for the elastic artery, the elastic fiber is in higher proportion and muscular artery has a lower proportion. That is why the arteries are named as such. Elastic artery is called the elastic artery because it has a higher proportion of elastic fiber. Muscular artery have a higher proportion of smooth muscles in their middle layer. That's the difference between the two of them. They also have some students who ask, what about the collagen fibers? Both the elastic arteries and muscular arteries have collagen fibers, but we don't have to care about it. Our main comparison between them is the smooth muscles and the elastic fiber. The arterioles, however, have the highest proportion of smooth muscles and they have very minimal elastic fibers. So what we have to know about the arterioles is just the fact that the middle section is made up of mostly smooth muscles. It does have elastic fiber, but it's extremely minimal in its proportion. So these are the difference in the elastic artery, muscular artery, and the arterioles. So of course then as a student, you must be like, okay, why do they have different compositions of their middle layer? There is a reason for that, obviously. Looking at the elastic artery, our main focus is the fact that it has a high amount of elastic fiber. So the question is, why do elastic arteries need a high proportion of this very elastic fiber? So elasticity, before we go into that in detail, is just imagine a rubber band. A rubber band is elastic because when you stretch the rubber band, it's able to accommodate the pull, but when you let go of the rubber band, it will go back to its original shape. So that's what elasticity means, okay? So elastic arteries also have this kind of property. So I'm drawing out a heart over here filled with blood. Now imagine if the heart is connected to an artery that is non-elastic, which means to say it is not elastic. Why would this be a problem? This would be a problem because when the heart contracts to pump the blood into the artery, the pressure within the artery becomes very high because the blood is rushing into the artery. Okay? And because there is going to be a high pressure in the artery, what will happen is, imagine the artery to be non-elastic, like a wooden ruler. If you put pressure on the wooden ruler, if the pressure is sufficient, the wooden ruler will not bend because it's not elastic. It will snap and break due to the high pressure. The same thing will happen to the artery if it's not elastic. It will just break and rupture and blood will start to leak out. This is extremely dangerous because this is called an internal hemorrhage or internal bleeding, and this can be quite dangerous for the person. So the solution to this problem is the artery closest to the heart is quite elastic because when the heart pumps the blood and the pressure in the artery is very high, just like a plastic ruler which is quite elastic, when you apply pressure on the ruler, it bends, but it does not break. Same thing happens to the artery as well. The wall bends outwards or it stretches outwards to accommodate that very high pressure. So that's a good thing. So the artery will stretch under high pressure and that's what creates a pulse. So if you touch the artery near your neck, on the side of your neck, or if you were to touch a specific part of your wrist, you're able to feel the artery stretch, and that's called the pulse. That pulse is when the artery wall is stretching due to high pressure. So the stretching is important because it prevents the artery from breaking or rupturing under high pressure. And of course, the plastic ruler, when you let go, when you do not apply pressure on it anymore, it returns to its original shape. The same thing happens to the artery wall, because when the heart relaxes, the artery wall does not remain bulged outwards. Immediately what will happen is it will recoil back to its original shape. Okay, and the recoil is good because when it recoils, the blood that is collected in that artery will be pushed forward. So this is why elastic arteries have a high proportion of elastic fibers. The very important reason is to allow it to stretch under high pressure, so it prevents the artery wall from bursting, and it also allows the artery wall to recoil, to push the blood forward, and in doing so, it maintains a high pressure in the artery. So this elasticity of the artery is important to ensure that the artery is functioning the way it's supposed to function, because the artery is supposed to push blood forward at high pressures constantly. So stretching will prevent it from bursting under high pressure. The recoil allows it to maintain a high pressure within the artery. This is basically what the elastic artery is all about. So going next to the muscular artery, as a reminder, has a high proportion of smooth muscles. So the question is, why? Why does it need a high proportion of smooth muscles within the muscular artery? The reason is because it wants to control blood flow. And when I say control, it means increase or decrease blood flow. Then you might want to ask the question, how is it able to increase or decrease blood flow? It is able to control the blood flow due to two processes. And the two processes are as follows: vasoconstriction and vasodilation. In vasoconstriction, the smooth muscles in the artery will contract. And look at the size of the lumen. The size of the lumen is very small. But in vasodilation, the smooth muscles will relax. I want you to see what happens to the size of the lumen. It will increase. So when the lumen size decreases, well, obviously, less blood will flow through. And conversely, when the lumen size increases, more blood flow is able to happen. So as students, you might be thinking, okay, why does I thought arteries are just these automatic tubes where blood flows through constantly, no matter what. See, this is where we are wrong. Our body is constantly controlling the amount of blood going to specific parts of the body through vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Let's talk about a real life example. Now, I'm drawing out an artery where it branches, or the artery reaches a junction where it goes into two muscular arteries. One muscular artery is transporting blood to the stomach, and one muscular artery is transporting blood to the leg muscles. This is just my example, by the way. So right now, the amount of blood going to the stomach and leg muscles is almost similar. The stomach is getting the same amount of blood as the leg muscles. Now imagine you are running away because a scary monster is chasing after you. I have no idea what that monster is. I wanted to draw an otter, but I can't make otters look scary. But just bear with me with that monster. So the monster is chasing after you. Now, when the monster is chasing after you, your leg muscles, because you are running, your leg muscles need more oxygenated blood. Okay, so when your leg muscles need more oxygenated blood, our body has to go into this mode where, well, if one part of the body needs more blood, it has to compromise another part of the body. That's how our body works. Okay, so if the leg muscles need to receive more blood, the stomach has to receive less blood, because it has to shunt or divert extra blood to the leg muscles. How does it do so? It does so by the muscular arteries at the top undergoing vasoconstriction, and the muscular arteries to the leg muscles undergo vasodilation. So in doing so, the stomach receives less blood, and more blood is then able to be shunted or diverted to the leg muscles so that you can run away from the scary monster. Hopefully, okay, hopefully. So vasoconstriction and vasodilation allows the body to control which organs or which tissues need to receive less blood, which tissues need to receive more blood. And last but not least, we also have the arterioles. As a reminder, arterioles are smaller branches of arteries. They are like arteries, but they are extremely small, by the way, in their size. And they have a very, very, very high proportion of smooth muscles in their middle layer or middle section. First question, why are they extremely small? The reason why arterioles have to be very small is because in the artery, blood is moving extremely fast, but the moment they go into the arteriole, the size of the lumen is quite small that it slows the blood down. This is important to happen. Now, I know a lot of students may think, oh, well, if blood slows down, that's not good. In this case, the arteriole has to slow the blood down significantly. The reason will be explained when we talk about capillaries in the next video. And last but not least, it also has a high proportion of smooth muscles so that it's able to do vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Just like we saw a few minutes ago, these two processes help to control blood flow to specific areas in our body. So in summary, the elastic artery, which is closest to the heart, has a high proportion of elastic fibers. Muscular arteries, which are slightly further away from the heart, has a higher proportion of smooth muscles and lower proportion of elastic fibers. And arterioles are just very small and they have a high proportion of smooth muscles. The reason why elastic artery needs to have a high proportion of elastic fiber is so that it can stretch and recoil. Muscular arteries mostly do vasodilation and vasoconstriction, and arterioles have to be very small, as a reminder, to slow down blood flow, and also they do vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Now, an important question students ask me, some students have asked me this question before. They asked, oh, muscular arteries do not have much elastic fibers. Are they able to also stretch and recoil? The answer is yes. Muscular arteries can also stretch and recoil, but they don't do it as well as elastic arteries. All right? So all arteries are able to stretch and recoil. All arteries are able to do a degree of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. But elastic artery does stretch and recoil much better. Muscular arteries are way better at vasodilation and vasoconstriction. All right? So that's the difference between all of them.